Hey, I'm Matt. Welcome to my podcast, The Imagining, a time to explore the imagination, creativity, and mental health. All of the conversations I'm having form part of the research for my new book. I hope that you have the opportunity during this time to discover something new about yourself. So, thanks so much for coming on. We've been friends for a long time. Just enlighten everyone that's listening. Tell us who you are, what you're about, what do you spend your days doing?
So I do poetry full time. I like to say that I'm international at this point since I've been in a few places, which is really exciting. And that's what I spend most of my time doing. If I'm not writing, I am memorizing. If I'm not memorizing, I'm writing something new or going to some sort of museum or something to gain some sort of inspiration.
What kind of museum does one go to find inspiration?
I go everywhere. Last year I went to, where did I go? I went to the Netherlands and there was the Van Gogh Museum.
Yeah.
Oh, that was so good. That's probably one of the best museums I've been to. And obviously the usuals like the Science Museum, Natural History Museum.
So you just wake up some mornings just seeking inspiration, go find a cheeky museum somewhere.
Yeah.
Take in some vibes.
Or sometimes I'll just go on a drive. So I love to go on drives. I like scenery. Scenery really encourages me to be creative. I like to sit there and just write or think about something. It just helps me to be at peace.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important when you're creative.
So just give us a spread. You do more things in a week than most people I know.
Yeah.
Just tell us, what are the things that you give your time to practically during any given week?
Well, I am a wife, so that takes up quite a bit of my time. You know, all the usual cooking, the cleaning. I spend quite a bit of time doing that. We are living with my dad, so he's got cancer. So I spend a lot of time caring and helping my dad as well. The usuals, you know, doing his hair, making sure that he's okay, also cooking him food. What else do I like to do? I do a lot of travel. My husband's a full-time musician, so I also help him with what he's doing. I probably do most of the admin in our house because he's not a huge fan of it. And poetry stuff, I tend to think quite big. So a lot of the time I'm doing a lot of reading and thinking about these crazy ideas that I have in my mind and then figuring out how can I get these ideas to come into fruition. I was actually saying earlier to you that one of the things I was in a conversation recently about a drone show. So, you know, the past couple of days, my brain has been thinking all about drones and lights and things like that, which has been pretty cool.
And they asked you to write a spoken word for a drone show.
So it's not for a drone show. It's early days. So the opening piece is one of the potential options is for there to be a drone show around this piece. And it's all about nature and stars and things like that, which is super cool.
Wow. There you have it then, drone shows. And you also run another organization called the Christian Busking Project.
Yes, I do.
What's that about?
So if
the name isn't explanatory enough already.
Yeah, exactly. The name speaks for itself. But what we do is we do street worship. So we go onto the streets of mainly London and we worship in different areas. Gives people a contact point with Christianity. And we do about 96 outreaches a year, which is pretty good. And we have, I think, 27 volunteers at this point. So that's pretty good. It's exciting.
And it's been a bit of a process to grow that, I would have thought.
Definitely. Nobody tells you when you get into the non-profit space that managing volunteers is such a big task. It takes a lot of mental power, and it also takes a lot of patience and grace to really make sure that you're caring for those people, but you're also making sure that they're committing to what they've agreed to and that they're also satisfied at the same time. It's a weird space.
Mm-hmm. So on the theme that we're kind of exploring on this audio series or podcast, whatever you want to call it, what's your take, big picture, imagination, creativity, mental health? When I first proposed the idea of you coming on to this show, what was your kind of mind doing?
Well, I think when I think of what you were saying, the imagination is such a big thing. It's something we can't see. it's also beyond the realms of reality, which is also quite complicated, because how do you bring that imagination into reality, I think is one of the biggest thoughts that came to my mind when I was thinking. Also, something else that came to mind when you were telling me about this podcast series is I'm reading this book currently, and in one of the notes in the book, it talks about the HBR review. And in the HBR review, it talks about how it's advised that each human has one full day a week to just do their own thing and be outside of their day-to-day responsibilities and work commitments. And I thought that was really interesting, because I think when I think of imagination, I think of it as a garden. It needs the right conditions to grow. But a lot of the time, because of our culture, we're so kind of work driven that sometimes that imagination gets suffocated and it kind of loses its way. So those are some of the thoughts that came to mind when you were sharing it with me.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you pick up on that theme. It's like the imagination, in a sense, is almost like sidelined. Almost like one of the things that I've been really reading about and writing about has been about how imagination is kind of left behind at childhood, in a sense. Like, we're happy to be creative or entrepreneurial, but there's almost like a discomfort with being an adult, being imaginative. And I think it probably has something to do with the idea that, you know, work is so prevalent for us that sometimes it feels like in order just to get by, you have to just put the imagination in like a special space over there and then not really let it into life, even though that's not actually what I think is happening, because obviously we use our imaginations all the time in all kinds of situations, right down to cooking, conversations, how to brew a tea, milking first, milking afterwards, whatever it may be. It is obviously a very real and important part of all of our lives, but it is also sidelined. I guess one of the big things that maybe is a good question to ask someone who's so outwardly creative, I think lots of people would say to you, like, well, it's easy for you maybe to have your imagination actually be engaged in what you do because you're a poet. How do you see it, like the imagination and creativity particularly, playing out in the space where maybe you're not a poet, you're not an artist, and you would say, I'm not even creative? How do you see that unraveling itself?
Well, I think there's two things to that. I think the first thing is, I think when it comes to 9 to 5s, I think employers actually need to do a better job at allowing their employees to be creative. They need to allow them to have that flexibility. And it's a shame, because a lot of what I do, which is, you know, contractual work or freelance work within organizations and companies, even within the organizations, they don't really know how to allow the people that are working there to be creative. And I think part of that is allowing them to take risk and giving them the flexibility to do that. I think one of the companies that do this really well is Google, because they allow, I think it's a 20% they allow their employees to have 20% of their time to explore something that may not necessarily be particularly work related. And I thought that was pretty good when I heard that. And I think also the other thing is making sure that you are not, I suppose, putting yourself in a box as to what you think creativity is. I personally still believe that a surgeon is creative. I believe that there is some form of creativity in that. I think maths can also be creative. As much as we think it's logical, there are also creative elements to it, I believe. So for example, you have to use geometry and things like that in architecture. But if you didn't have the maths, you couldn't be creative. So I think we have to open up our ideas as to what we think creativity is. And it's not just, oh, because she's a poet, she's creative. And I think we all have a sense of creativity in us. Like, ultimately, we all have the ability to, I suppose, think outside of the box, so to speak. And if we do that, then we're all creatives.
And what do you kind of think maybe on the shadow side of that? Like, how do you kind of see the imagination playing out in terms of, you know, mental health, maybe anxiety, Like, because obviously that's another real element of our imaginations, is that, and maybe that is prevalent among the creative community particularly,
Yeah.
but also would just be like massively important for anyone of our generation, because it does seem like there's a huge kind of mental health pandemic in a sense, where
Yeah.
our imaginations are just all over the shop.
It's so true. And it is really unfortunate, because it seems that as society has progressed, we have almost become more depressed. There's a lot more kind of mental illness that is surrounding our current society. When I was at uni, I studied psychology, and I think one of the really interesting things about that was creativity was a tool for self-expression. I particularly remember this one study. I cannot remember for the life of me who did this study, but it was this study about women that had cancer. And essentially, in the study, they allowed the women to journal their thoughts, how they felt, whether that was writing a poem, whether that was writing how they felt, whether that was sharing a story, and just writing that for 3 to 5 days. And they found that their recovery rate was a lot quicker than those that were just not able to do those things. And I think just even when it comes to mental health and the ability to express oneself, there's something about releasing something and putting it out there, whether that's on a page or speaking it, so that your body can become free of that and it doesn't feel bound by those thoughts or those feelings anymore. So I think creativity is like so necessary in that space of mental health. And it's needed because creativity allows us to express ourselves, and it allows us to communicate something that maybe we wouldn't be able to communicate if we didn't have that creativity.
Which brings us nicely on to, I think that one of the key conversations that I guess actually we've probably been having for years now, is all around this idea of, well, how do I take my ocean of thoughts and ideas and imaginings and wonderings and ponderings and all the other ings that you can think of, and, you know, bring them out of yourself, so to speak? Because I think that this is potentially like the other side of the coin, is that we often consider imagination to be the exploit of the mind. But at some point, the exploit of the mind has to turn into, well, it doesn't have to, I guess. Sometimes it's good just to entertain an idea and just let your brain do what it feels like it needs to do. But how would you, for you, what is that process? You have a thought. Do you ignore it? Do you ride with it? Like, what's your thought life like in terms of imagination, and what do you choose to hold on to, and what do you choose to get rid of?
I think that's such a good question, because I personally don't particularly wrestle with my imagination. It's the challenge that I have is the reality part, because essentially there's a point now where my imagination has to meet reality, and there are some confines to what reality can do and what we're able to do at this current stage in life, technologically, socially, and so forth. So I think for me, the first thing is I have to write it down. And I love the acronym BHAG, Big, Hairy, Audacious Goals. I love that. I love that acronym. Because that's
very vivid.
It's so poignant. But the other thing, there's this book I'm reading called Find Your Unicorn Space by Eve Rodsky, and she talks about adding another A to that, which is authentic. So it needs to be a big, hairy, audacious, authentic goal. So I usually write down anything that comes to my mind, and then I filter it through my values. So one of my values is I'm a huge fan of like learning. I like to learn, and I like a challenge. If it doesn't fit into those things, I'm already throwing it out the door because I'm not interested. It's boring to me if it's not, if it's not dramatic. And then the other thing I'll do is I need to think of the kind of reality that I'm in. So, for example, if I'm thinking of something really big and it requires a lot of finance, I need to figure out how am I going to cover this thing? Can I get sponsorship? Can I get funding? Can I save for it? What are the parameters within that? And then usually, I suppose from a production standpoint, you have to work within your budget. So now our huge imagination, our huge goal is now being filtered within the confines of a budget or a location that we may have available or something like that.
So filtering your imagination through your values.
Yeah.
That's a really wonderful articulation of, I think, something that's like extremely important, because almost in a sense, like a lot of people describe imagination as like chaos in a sense, but not chaos in the negative sense, chaos in terms of almost like Lego bricks scattered across the floor.
Yeah.
And it's just like this random mess of unexplored, unknown building blocks. And you know, sometimes they can cause pain, like when you stand on a Lego piece and it's excruciating, but actually it's latent waiting potential. But obviously this values bit is a filter through which you take the raw chaos and give it some sense of order. What for you are the kind of values that you shape your imagination with?
So do you mean like what are my values? Like what are they?
I guess. Yeah. What are the key, but I guess like, are they the same values as you would just say for everything else? Or do you have specific filters for your imagination?
I feel like they overlap because a lot of my life is, I feel like I filter a lot of my life through my creativity. But I would say my main values are mastery. I am a huge fan of like doing things well, not just, I'm just going to throw something together because I want to. No, but literally making sure that everything that I'm doing is good, and not just good, but to the best standard that I can possibly make sure that I'm doing it at. The second thing is knowledge. I don't like to do things without having prior knowledge or understanding how things work. So I will never really speak on a topic that I don't really know anything about. Like you'll never, like I'm comfortable here because I spend so much time being creative. But if somebody asks me to talk about being a mum, I mean, it's not going to work for me because I'm not a mum. Unless I've done some sort of research to kind of justify me being there. The third thing is being authentic. So I pride myself on being honest. I don't like trying to do things for money or, you know, to exploit things. I'll only put something out if I genuinely feel that it is honest and true to me and I'm okay with it being out there. And the other one is storytelling. So I love to storytell. I value storytelling. I think telling people stories are important. And I want to make sure that I communicate those things well. So when it comes to a project, I need to make sure that those things are covered. I also mentioned challenge earlier. That's another one. If they're not filtered through those things, I'm not really interested. So what, like, just not there.
What does that look like, I guess? Because in a sense, we've spoken about the concept of wrestling with your imagination, which is, again, like quite a vivid image of almost like, in my head, I see like two like gigantic sumo wrestlers on a thing. And one is like your imagination. And it's just this rogue, unknown entity. And one is your conscious thinking, I guess. And you're having a wrestling match and trying to figure out who's going to come out as victor. And in a sense, you're saying maybe your values are the thing that are wrestling with your imagination. Your values are the thing that go up against the thoughts that you're having. And choose whether to let it go past or reject it and push it back. Is there things that you can recall that maybe haven't crossed the value test, in a sense, that have come up against the filter and have been pushed back? Either positive or negative imaginings in that sense.
So there's one example that comes to mind. I can't remember all the details because this was like 2017. But when I did the nationwide Building Society advert, around that time I was asked to do, I think it was like a drinking campaign. I can't remember like the details of it, but it was this campaign. And I also got asked to do some swimwear stuff as well. And taking it through the filters, like, those are my kind of motivating values. But thinking of me as a person, I don't drink. So, I mean, first of all, even if it's like responsible drinking, I don't drink at all. So it just wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be integral and it wouldn't be authentic, as I mentioned earlier, for me to do something like that. It just wouldn't. Also, I think the other thing that motivates me when it comes to values and processing and figuring out what things pass that kind of those filters is how I want people to see me. I don't think I've always been perfect at that, but I try my best. And obviously as a creative, there is room for error. So, and I think sometimes, for example, with like the values of like authenticity, that can be quite a hard one, because sometimes you want to be authentic, but sometimes it's not the right time. Or sometimes you have the knowledge about something, but is society ready to hear that yet? So it's difficult. There are so many factors. I think back to, because I did business and psychology with French at uni, and I think about, there's this model called PESTLE, and it's like political, economic, social, technological, and it goes through all these kind of factors. And sometimes when it comes to creativity, if you put them through those filters, it's just not time to bring it out yet. So there's more, there's so much to that, you know?
Yeah. And would you see that value system also plays into stuff like, obviously imagination and creativity comes out in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned earlier about your dad, for example. Would you see that them value systems about your thought life when you're thinking about your dad, and them things that may be a bit more closer to home? How does thoughts about your dad go through your value system in a way? Like, how do you choose how to respond to your head? Because obviously that it must be quite a lot of worrying thoughts and concerning thoughts for you.
Do you mean that in relation to what I share creatively about my dad, or do you just mean like generally?
just in general, just like on a like real low key way?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of it is with my dad. It can be quite difficult because sometimes he's okay and then other times he's not. I mean, he's got cancer, not just one but multiple, and he's got a terminal prognosis. So I think for me, when I'm looking at my values, I want to make sure that I suppose I'm leaning more towards the authentic and being honest and being sensitive to where he's at. I also think that it does kind of filter through my creativity, because a lot of what I feel, I'm a very sensitive person. I feel a lot of what my dad experiences. It's weird because so much so, sometimes I feel like he'll say he's in pain somewhere later on in the day, and earlier on in the day I felt the same pain. And it's weird. I think what I try to do is I try not to lock those things away, but I try my best to embrace them when they're there. Like even with the storytelling one, it's like one thing I've been really intentional with my dad when it comes to talking to my dad recently is collecting stories, like mental stories. What did you go through? How did you feel about this? What are your thoughts about what's going on in the news today? So that, you know, when he's not here anymore, I've got something to hold on to, because essentially, as we're talking about the imagination, like he's still going to be up here. And I don't want that, my thoughts of him to change to something that doesn't really exist. Hopefully that makes some sort of sense.
No, yeah. For sure does. And I think that's the real weird thing about the imagination, isn't it? Is that so much of who we are exists up there as well as outside. And there's always this ebb and flow between like wrestling internally and then the wrestle with how you think and curate things outside of yourself, like relationships with your dad, all the way through to more like poetry or starting a company.
It's true. And I think, do you know what, in as much as it is difficult, I think there is something really special about watching those moments and watching I suppose him experiencing what he's experiencing. Nobody's gonna see that but me, because I'm there all the time. And I think like I would like never take those moments away. I think they're really special. And I think like those moments are they are part of creativity. If my life as a creative is, you know, it's based on what I experience, it's based on what I know, it's based on what challenges me, and it's based on authenticity, then part of that authenticity is living in those moments and accepting them for what they are. So I think a lot of what you said makes total sense.
So on the basis that everyone is having to work with their imaginations and their creativity along the whole spectrum of life, whether that be starting a company all the way through to living in really like profoundly painful experiences like you have to live through with your dad.
Yeah.
How do people identify their values if maybe they haven't done that before in order to accurately and healthily have a filter for their imagination?
Yeah, that's really, really good. I think one thing to say even just before that is you need to know what your values are, and that's so important. And I think that's a really good question, because if you don't have your values, you'll just go for anything. There has to be a standard that you live by. One of the things that I did is I thought about what has always made me curious as a child. And I called up my parents. This is actually a few days ago, funny enough. I called up my parents and I said, what was I curious about as a child? And both my parents said exactly the same thing. They said that, Storm, you've always been interested in knowledge, and you just wanted to read a lot. In fact, when you were at school, you used to get annoyed at people because they would talk and you just wanted to listen, and you were just so interested in that. And they also said something that was a bit shady, but they said you just weren't really interested in really like playing with people because you just wanted to absorb everything. So I really like challenge, and I've always liked knowledge from being a young child. So I would say ask your parents. I'm on the Hayley Melinda Speak Up course, as I was saying to you earlier. And one of the things it asks you to do is to ask the people around you, like, what do you value? What do you think I value? What do you think I'm interested in? So that you can gain a holistic picture. And in the book that I mentioned earlier, essentially there was like a list of like 100 values, and it asked you to pick 3. I thought that was quite hard, because I think 3 out of 100 is like...
Yeah, man, that's a big ask.
Yeah, that's a big ask. Maybe it wasn't 100, maybe it was less than that, maybe like 50 or 60, I'm not sure, but it was a huge list. But look at the list. Find a list of values online and think about which ones you resonate with the most and which ones you resonate with the least. That's
really useful, I think. And I hadn't thought about this since before. And as you'll know, big part of this whole conversation is about like trying to fill out some ideas and gaps in the book that I'm writing.
Exactly.
And the whole idea that your values are such an important filter for your thoughts, for your creativity, is profoundly simple in many ways, isn't it? Because it can really like be a really sharp tool in identifying what's useful and what is like worthy of being discarded. What about someone that maybe feels like they have their value system? Can you speak to how you would maybe go about connecting a thought or an imagining or an idea to that value system? What's the process of reconciling them together?
So if you had a value, for example, of family, like family is a really important thing to you and it's something that you really appreciate. And let's just say like you are a cook, so to speak. Maybe part of your creation is developing new recipes to share with your family. Like, I think sometimes the good thing about having values is it allows you to figure out what you're focusing on and what your focus is. If you don't have values, a lot of the time when I forget what my values are, I tend to want to create everything and anything at all times. Like the other day I was thinking, you know what really fascinates me? Like artificial intelligence. I want to learn how to like do code and like make
be
data
the boss of,
Exactly. But and maybe that would work for my values because I like mastery and I like a challenge. But I also have to bring that back to reality and acknowledge that I don't actually have the time to be a data artist, you know, and figure out data sets and things like that. And be like a Rafiq Andal or something. But the reality is it's figuring out what those things are, and they could be anything. You know, your value might just be I like a traditional household, and your creativity in that is how you decorate your home. I think there's something really special about that. But it's not putting your values in a box, but it's figuring out how can I combine them together with what I'm interested in to make sure that I'm creating things that are unique and special and meaningful to the world. Because I think also we think about, okay, if I'm going to be creative, I have to get some external validation from it. But actually the value is in the intrinsic value that we receive from it. We should have an intrinsic motivation to do those things rather than, okay, I'm going to get 1 million followers on TikTok. You need to have something that's not just, pulling you along, but is actually keeping you grounded, which is so important. That's
really interesting, actually, because I guess what that means is that regardless of what you're producing, whether that be a good conversation, whether that be a new cake that you've made,
right?
If you're measuring it by your value system, then you can almost guarantee success.
Yeah, 100%.
Because all of these external factors are so hard to quantify and so hard to find. But if you know that you've put an idea through the value test almost, like, does this thing in my imagination line up to my values? Then if it does, then you can always look back at that moment and be like, oh, that actually, that brought my family together. And that was enough because family came together around the cake.
Yeah.
Or I just wanted to write something because stories are important to me.
Yeah.
Then it doesn't matter if even people read it. It's like the value is enough in terms of trying to achieve what you set out to do.
Yeah.
So in terms of like just finishing out this episode, what are maybe what is the big takeaway for you of this conversation?
I think the big takeaway is that you need to make sure that your imagination is being filtered through your values. I think that is probably, I didn't expect that to be the takeaway, but it probably is. And I think, let's be real, our imagination can go to the ends of the earth. It can be either really positive or really negative. And we have to make sure that whatever that imagination is doing, that's being filtered through some sort of compass. And that compass has to be our values.
That's a perfect takeaway.
Yeah.
Mate, I feel so privileged that we've been able to go on this discovery process together in a sense, because in a way it's nothing like the conversation that we had kind of pre this or ever before. So I think that's the real beauty of sitting and just letting a conversation go where it needs to go. Yeah. Thank you so much for having this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for the learning, and I look forward to seeing how your imaginings continue to come out of you and do beautiful things. And good luck.
Thank you so much, and same to you.
Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this episode of The Imagining. I hope that you've had the opportunity to discover something new about yourself. If you wouldn't mind and you enjoyed listening, then I would be really appreciative if you subscribed on whatever channel you're listening on.